In this section, we're going to take a look at some records in DNS. On my Windows server, I'm going to pull up my Server Manager console. In Server Manager, I'm going to go to Tools, and I'm going to select DNS from the list of administrative tools. I'm going to full screen DNS here. When I click on my DNS server and expand it, I have this folder named Forward Lookup Zone. Inside of that folder, I have two zones that show up. Now, a zone in DNS is represented by a folder icon with this page icon kind of stuck on top of the folder. That's a zone. Easiest way to think of the zone is to think of it as a folder, and it contains all the DNS records for a specific domain. Now, in a later section, we dive into the zones, the different types of zones, and all their characteristics. For now, we want to look at the Atlantis.local zone. Again, for now, whenever you say that term, hear that term, think of it only as a folder that contains all the records for a specific domain. When I expand Atlantis.local, I have a few records that show up. I have a record for a computer named LUNDC1. What this zone does is contain the records that tells me LUNDC1, the computer with that name, has an IP address 172.16.0.10. So it simply takes that name and maps or resolves that name to an IP address. I also have a computer named LUNCL1 right above that. Its IP address is 172.16.0.11. So I have this DNS zone, Atlantis.local. My domain has two computers right now. One is a domain controller, LUNDC1. The other is LUNCL1. If I were in a larger environment and I had hundreds of computers, I would have 100 records show up in this Atlantis.local zone. Every computer, every server that is a member of my domain, when it's on the network, it would have a record automatically created by default in this zone, Atlantis.local. What we want to look at in this section are the different types of records that exist. I'm going to right-click my Atlantis.local, and I get this menu. Now, you could also just right-click in empty space here, and you would get the same drop-down menu. One option is New Host A, or Quad A, we call it. The 4 A's, they just refer to that as a Quad A record. The New Host A record is for IP version 4. The host Quad A will be for IP version 6. Now, I want to show you both of those. So I'm going to select New Host A. The top field asks me to type in the name. I'm going to just type in the name, LUN-CL2. Below that, it asks for the IP address. I'm going to use the IP address 172.16.0.12. I'm going to click Add Host. Now, this new host window assumes that you may create more than one record, so the window stays open until you click Done, until you close the X. So I'm going to just slide this window down. But notice LUN-CL2 has a host A record 172.16.0.12. So now this DNS server has the ability to resolve the name LUNCL2 to that IP address. In this new host box, I'm going to type LUN-CL3. In the IP address, this time I'm going to enter an IP version 6 address. I'm just going to type the address FD00:1234. That's a valid IP version 6 address. Looks very weird, but that actually is a valid IPv6 address. I'm going to click Add Host. It creates that record, and I'm going to click Done just to get the window to close. And notice the IPv6 address shows up here. Now, this IPv6 address, the way it's formatted, has a lot of zeros in it. So it does not look exactly the way it was when we typed it in. That's all IP version 6, that has no relationship directly to DNS. In DNS, what we are concerned with, LUNCL3 has this IPv6 host quad A. Because my computer has an IP version 6 address, when that record is created, it automatically generates an IP version 6 host quad A. When I created the record and I simply typed in an IP version 4 address, it made it a host A record. So depending on the address that's used when you register or create a record, depends on if you will have a host A or a host quad A record created. Now, if I right-click my zone again, there's also a new alias, CNAME. It's more common that people will refer to it as an alias now instead of a CNAME. But an example of an alias, let's say I have a web server. I want people to be able to resolve the name and connect to my web server. Well, what I'm going to do here is create a new host A record first. I'm going to name this host A record Web SRV. I'm going to type in an IP address, 172.16.0.200. And I'm going to add that host. And I'll click Done. So now I have this Web SRV. If I go to the command prompt on my machine, in the command prompt, I'm going to type ping web SRV. Notice it automatically resolved that web SRV to IP address 172.16.0.200. Now, it gives me destination host unreachable, as expected, because that's not actually a machine that's on my network. But what I know to be true is DNS completely worked. It took that name and resolved that name to that IP address. A concern I have now, no user would connect to WebServe by name or by IP address. My user would want to type www.mydomain. To do that, I need to create a new alias. I'm going to create an alias, and I'm just going to name it www. You'll notice it took www in this fully qualified domain name box, and it automatically appended atlantis.local to the back of it. Below that, it lets me browse for the target host A record. So I'm going to just browse through that window, my forward lookup zone, atlantis.local. In that list, I have WebServe. So I'm going to choose the WebServe record. OK and OK. This explains everything. Now, if someone types www, it automatically resolves that to WebServe. So www is just an alias that gets resolved to WebServe. Now, I still have to resolve this to an IP address. So above, WebServe gets resolved to that address 172.16.0.200. So now, if someone were to ping or try to connect to my site in any way, www.atlantis.local, it resolves that name to 172.16.0.200. None of my users would ever have to know the name of my web server that actually hosts the website. They would not have to know the IP address of the website. They simply could type www. Another possibility, if I go back to new alias, it says alias name, use parent domain if left blank. What's possible is for me to leave that blank, and I could simply browse out to my web serve, and I could OK that. Now, you don't have to type www. Someone could just type my domain name in the browser, and it would connect. An example of that is when you browse the Microsoft.com website, most of you probably do not type www.microsoft.com. You just type Microsoft.com. So we could do that same with an alias. one for www, one for a blank alias that just resolves the domain name to that web server. So those are two very common types of records. The host A record, the CNAME, and the host quad A record we did look at as well. The other common record here is a new mail exchanger. A new mail exchanger, or an MX record is commonly referred to as, is simply a record that you would use for an email server. So if I have a Microsoft Exchange server, or any email server, it does not have to be a Microsoft email server, I would type in my email server fully qualified domain name, and I would specify my domain name itself, and it would create a mail exchanger record. So we would be able to communicate with our email server and retrieve all of our messages. In most environments, unless you are the jack of all trades and you manage Active Directory, DNS, email, and all the other settings, which many people will not do, if you are in an environment that's a little more separate, you may have dedicated email administrators. If that's true, they will either create these records themselves or they will tell you how the record should be defined. Like what name, what priority. But in that list, those were our common types of records. Host A or quad A, CNAME, mail exchanger.